Allora, ricominciamo con il secondo intervento. Benoît, vi ho detto che è un antropologo. Il focus della sua ricerca, come accennavo precedentemente, sono l'Africa coloniale, a parte il Brasile, che così come area diciamo geografica di interesse, e tutti i discorsi che gravitano sulla l'eredità coloniale. È un autore di numerosissimi saggi che entrano in maniera preponderante nella dinamica della revisione critica dei musei di etnografia, tra cui cito una cosa tra le tantissime, appunto le guide sopra. Benoît ci parlerà di le sfide dei musei contemporanei, paradigmi museologici per un nuovo millennio. Il suo intervento sarà in inglese. Prego.
Grazie. Prima di tutto vorrei ringraziare il Museo Pigorini per l'invito a partecipare di quello workshop che mi fa piacere, che il Museo Pigorini è un museo che conosco un po' e che mi piace per la prospettiva e anche con la riflessione sui musei organizzata tra l'altro nella rivista Antropologia Museale. Adesso parlo in okay, so first of all, I'd like to say that I'm not responsible for the title, the grand title of this talk, which was given to me by Victor Latanzi, and then they said, well, you could change it, but for lack of a better title, I stuck with that, and but hopefully I know that it's bound to be disappointing, and I want to lower your expectations from the start, especially in front of such an audience. People who work in museums, who reflect on museums, and have a lot of experience on these topics. I'm sure I won't bring you much in terms of reflection. What I try to do is to give you, in a way, kind of an outsider's view of a museum goer with a special interest for museums of the self, museum of the other, the world over, and well, I make a bit of strolling in various museums, trying to think around the topics which are the topic of our meeting today. So first of all, the first thing is that to speak of museum paradigms for the new millennium is very ambitious because, of course, nobody knows really what a museum is in the first place. And the thing is that so many things go under the name of museum. There is such diversity of statuses, of size, of scope, of number of visitors. You have the museums who struggle to attract some visitors. For instance, the Museo delle Arti Popolari on the other side of the piazza closes during school holidays because mostly the public is by school pupils. Where some others struggle to deal with the flows of visitors, such as the Museo Vaticani or the Louvre. So basically, you have very different kinds of museums, and to speak of the museum in the singular practically doesn't make sense. So it's difficult really to see if there is something in common beyond the name. The topic of the workshop is visual arts, performing arts and museums, and of course it's a very exciting title, and it has to do with the fact that it seems that now, as we have heard in the first talk, art seems to be a kind of a solution for the museum crisis, especially for the crisis of the science museum, of the ethnography museum. And for instance, at the Museum für Völkerkunde in Frankfurt, with Clémentine Delis, who heads the museum, she changed completely the practice. It used to be quite a conservative, classical museum with displaying collections of ethnographic expeditions, and she changed it to bring contemporary art practice within the museum. And she called artists in residence, giving them kind of a free rein to pick up some things in the collection, to think about them, to think of exhibitions, and to do something new with it. And the residence of artists is a growing trend in ethnographic museums. There has been some interesting experience in Intervento in Belgium. We now heard that there is something, will be the case now at Pigorini, and it's certainly something which is significant. But then it's also we tend to think of the museum as in terms of content. When we think in terms of art, we want to change the content, we want to change the experience of the museum for the visitors. And we think in terms of exhibitions, what do we include, what do we not include, what to say, how to frame it, will we use artistic means, aesthetic means, pedagogic means, or all these things. So that's here, that's the notion of the sensory experience of art is entering. But I'd like to, so we put a lot of attention, we discuss it, we discuss the meaning of these exhibitions, of how we should do it, and what are the problems with the source community, and all of these things. But we like to start from something different with an experience on my, the place where I do field work in the northeast of Brazil. It's a rural place, and I work on laundry farm settlements. And at some point I organized an exhibition of pictures that had been taken years before on the very people of these settlements. And I talked to a young woman who is the daughter of people who were involved in that, and she told me, I don't like museums, I like shopping malls. And I was a bit taken aback, because of course I would have expected her to go and see the pictures of her relatives, of her neighbors, but she wasn't. But it's something which is interesting, because it shows that for her, there was, and of course she doesn't have the money to go to shopping malls. She doesn't go to shopping malls actually. But if she would go to some place, she would rather go to a shopping mall than to a museum. And I think it's interesting because it tells us that in a way there is an alternative, for some people at least, between going to a museum or going to a shopping mall. And another anecdote is my sister-in-law received some tourists, and so much last year she received some young Italian girls who spent a week in Paris, and every day they said, what did you do today? We went to the Louvre, which was really impressed. We would go to the Louvre every day, little money, and finally she discovered that by going to the Louvre, they meant going to the Louvre Commercial Center, the Commercial Center. That's where they went every day. So the Louvre doesn't mean the same thing for all the people. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind, and because we tend to think of the museum in terms of the content of the exhibitions, but for many visitors, maybe the museum shop and the restaurant is the most important part, and the surrounding the museum, most important part of the visit to the museum. So in a way, it's humbling. And a thing which is important, since this competition with shopping malls, it's the idea that you want to attract the visitors. You need to attract the people. So it's something which was old already. Paul Rivet, when he was opening the museums, we have to think of the museum as a department store, and the very idea of having temporary exhibitions was exactly to bring in some movement, to bring in some visitors, to make visitors come to the museum. But it's also interesting because we also have these kinds of places which we would hardly call museums, like here in Rome, this kind of historical Visio Roma experience, when you experience a travel in the Roman past, the museums of the chambers of torture, which people will visit. These are also the kind of things where people go. So the thing is, the museum is increasingly run by numbers. The numbers in terms of the number of visitors and the money, the funding, both private and public, and of course two things are related. You need to attract people, you need to get to having people talk about the museum, you need to have people coming, and of course that's true for the, and that's why you will run blockbuster exhibitions. Like you have these specialized museums like the new Pinacothèque in Paris, and that's here from my Viennese friends, an image from the current Klimt exhibition where they had a copy of the Beethoven frieze which was made especially for the exhibition, and you can see the throngs of people. They have large posters in the metro, throngs of people who go there and want to have the experience of going to Vienna without having to make the trip the trip there. So one other possibility for attracting, for much more established museums, is to attract museums. And here I go to this one of the standard museums, the Metropolitan Museum. You have the classical rooms, here the classical presentations, but they also are doing what I would call other exhibitions. Other exhibitions, you make an exhibition within the exhibition to attract people. Currently, they have this Through the Looking Glass show, which is in the China rooms, and they put on films, they put these kinds of glass sculptures, and they also have some fashion design. So within the rooms, you have the conjunction of dresses by great fashion designers and ancient tools. And this kind of thing. So you can, it's very much the kind of the atmosphere of a department store in a way, which is brought into the museum. Of course, it's a lot of success. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. You have the people here. It's really who are looking at the film by Wong Kar-wai, and you have these things. Finally, with the dresses imitating the china plates, which are on the side. What I find, and it's also kind of a trend of having like exhibitions within the exhibitions. In Rome, there is a terrible experience in the Mercati Traiani, where they have an exhibition which is a beautiful old Roman room, and they put kind of a multimedia thing on Augustus in the cities, and it spoils the room. You can't hear anything. It's in some ways it manages to destroy the museum by trying to attract some new things. It's also the case of the Capitolini Musée in Rome, which is one of my favorite museums all over the world, and where they also do put some shows which actually prevent the people from seeing the building, which is one of the most important assets, of course, of the museum. So I think it's interesting because this idea of attracting people, and of course using art and fashion, and this kind of mix of art and fashion, makes it for a great experience in a way. But when I asked the Guardian at the Metropolitan if it was normal lighting, he said, no, if you want to see the works, you have to come back later. So it was kind of really this idea. Okay, so what I want to say now is to say a few words about the French situation, the French change of a series of changes from museums which were inspired by natural history and ethnography to kind of more aesthetic experience. Of course, it is exemplified by the creation of the Museo du Quai Branly. But before actually the Museo du Quai Branly, there was already a discussion when the Great Gallery Revolution was remade in 1994. The architect, Paul Chemetov, said a museum is a place where every displayed artifact becomes a work of art, whatever its status. A museum is a way of looking. So finally, what he said, that there can be no scientific museum today, because a scientific museum is a fine arts museum with scientific objects. And he sort of, we had a complete change, of course, in natural history, which used to be done from museums with museum collections, and which increasingly has become to be made in laboratories, in universities, and the collections are all the time less involved in the real scientific work. So even if you still have some laboratories in some museums, some research centers, the use of the collections is marginal in contrast with the role they once held in the economy of knowledge. So what he says is the times have changed. It used to be a museum, and now museums and galleries are the art market. The concept of a scientific museum is impossible. I think it's very interesting as a provocation for us, because a number of you work in museums which were founded at least as scientific museums, as museums of science, even if they do not always define themselves as such now. But this idea that it's impossible is an interesting provocation. So actually, what they did is that the scenographer René Alliot displayed in the Grande Galerie, which is remade, this kind of great arc procession of naturalized animals of Africa, which of course is to the delight of the children and their parents who go there. So you do have on the sides the information if you want, but really the scenery, the construction is central. And what I find interesting is that it actually, in a way, it prefigures what will happen in the museums of ethnography in France, for the Musée du Quai Branly and the Musen in Marseille. I'll come to it in a minute. Okay. So the other thing is we also know that the museum is increasingly becoming itself a work of art. So it's the very museum. You don't go to the museum to see what's inside the museum. You go to the museum to see the museum itself. It's the National of the Arts Museum. Here it's by Renzo Piano, the Centre Culturel Jean-Marie Djibaou in Nouméa, which in a way dwarfs what's inside the building, and it's the new Whitney Museum by Renzo Piano in New York, where it's beautiful, of course, yeah, and it's all is done between the inside and the outside. You go, you see the city, you see the works, and you have this kind of atmosphere of the museum, which is in a way much more important than each specific work, which is within the museum. It's really the museum experience, in a way, is of being there in that space. And it's also something which is the case for the Musée du Quai Branly, which is by the architect Jean Nouvel, here from the inside at the opening. And also, when the museum was discussed, there was this. The project was by the French art dealer Jacques Kershach, who wanted to take all the objects of the Musée de l'Homme from the anthropologists, because they are Philistines. They don't know that they have real treasures and great works. So we have to take them and put them in order to bring them to the public, to have the public be able to take pleasure in them. So what's interesting is that it had the support of no less than Claude Lévi-Strauss, who wrote a letter, which was published in Le Monde, when he said, now the Ethnography Museum is from the past, because it's now unable to offer an authentic picture of the lives of societies most different from ours. At the same time that he was confirming that the Musée de l'Homme was a museum of others, he said it's something which now has become impossible. It was possible to present an authentic picture of the societies, but now it's not, because it's changed and they're not real anymore. So he said, when I look at the artifacts I collected in the fields, and it's in Brazil between 1935 and 1938, I know well that their interest has become either documentary or mostly aesthetic. From the first viewpoint, they belong to the laboratory or the study gallery. From the second, to the great museum of art and cultures wished by the direction of French Museum. So it was in a way echoing Chemetov, effectively announcing the death of the Musée Laboratoire, of the museum laboratory. What he says is that you have to differentiate, there is a dichotomy between what is art and what is science. So what is documentary goes to science, and what is art goes to an art museum. So basically it's the same thing as Chemetov. A science museum is impossible, has become impossible. So it has to be an art museum. So of course, it was a trump in the hands of the promoters of the Quai Branly to disqualify any criticisms from the anthropologists' quarter. And if you look actually at the way the museum is, you see from the inside, you see that everything is done for the gaze. You have some points of views on the museum itself, and here to contrast with what used to be the presentation of the Musée de l'Homme, very orthogonal with light, very pedagogic, and here you have, on the contrary, it's very obscure. It's lighter in this picture than in real life. What is, I think, interesting here is to make a comparison with the wall of André Breton, which is the National Museum of Modern Art at the Pompidou Center, where you see why, when it entered the collections, why didn't it take away the asthmat shields and the various things? It's not very clear, but you have lots of things. You have you have a mixture here. You see better maybe this kind of mixture of oceanic arts from the Easter Island and some art pictures. And why didn't they bring them to the Quai Branly and keep the art works in the Centre Bombeau? Because what is important here, the work of art is not every single piece. That's the assemblage, that's this kind of installation, that's a wall in itself. And exactly, in a way, it gives a key to understanding a museum like the Quai Branly, where what is important is not so much the individual works, as is the case, for instance, in the Louvre rooms, but the whole creation of an atmosphere by the very delicate display of art. Of course, you also have the lighting, which also comes from the collectors, here from a public sale at Drouot. You see the relationship, and this kind of mixtures of atmosphere. So, well, in fact, it would be inaccurate to describe the Quai Branly as just a primitive art museum. It's more appropriate to describe it as a post-ethnographic museum, because the project evolved into a museum of arts and civilizations of Africa, America, Asia, and Oceania, and incorporated some anthropological inputs. But the thing is that the knowledge is not any more structuring as it was in the middle. It is there. If you want to get the knowledge, you can go to the catalogs, go to the multimedia sites, but it's dispensable. You can do without it. It's not something which is organizing anymore. So it is moved away from the model of a collector's paradise, which was Kirchhoff's choice, to become a cultural center focusing on art, but with some inclusion of anthropology and also with lots of things going on. Okay. Yeah, now what's interesting is some people here from the MUSEM, from the Museum of European and Mediterranean Civilizations in Marseille, which is a very beautiful location right near the old Fort Saint-Jean in Marseille. A few images, also an architect's museums. It's a splendid way, and it's also where a lot of Marseillais go to stroll on the weekends. So it's a very nice place. You have a view from the sea, and you can spend some time on the terrace in the cafe. You don't really need to get into the museum. Actually, you can go there without paying a ticket. It's a deal, because by hoping that by this way, and I was told that about 1/3 of the visitors do go to the museum. So it's also a real success in terms of numbers. And if you get into the museums, in the permanent galleries of the Mediterranean, I can't go. People from Marseille will tell us there are many more things, and I can't talk about it here. It's pretty much the collections from the old Museum of Popular Arts, Folk and Arts and Traditions, which are displayed. Okay. And what's interesting is that in Marseille, you actually do have a physical disjunction between the collections, which are mostly from rural France and Europe, which are held in a special resource center, a very beautiful one. It's absolutely gorgeous, it's wonderful. Reservatory, and the museum. So that's really the idea also of Lévi-Strauss has been realized. You have the researchers can go there, can see the objects, but it's not for the public. Okay, and I also want to say a few words on the ethnographic art, which was mentioned already by Arne Schneider. It's many artists, they claim to be inspired by ethnography, the ethnographic term, the artist art ethnographer. And there is, for instance, there was the Contemporary Art Triennale in Paris 3 years ago, and with claiming an ethnological inspiration. So you had photographs by Lévi-Strauss, by Griol, the African objects photographs by Walker Evans at the MoMA exhibition, which were displayed along with works from contemporary artists. You also had the famous, for anthropologists, famous movie by Napoleon Chagnon, The Axe Fight, which is a very controversial movie about Yanomami warriors, which was also presented as being a really kind of an artistic film without any further comments, which I think is in a way emblematic of the problems in this use, in this what some people see as a happy marriage between art, contemporary art, and anthropology. I want to say a few words about this exhibition, which was the Fondation Cartier pour l'Art Contemporain, Yanomami, the Spirit of the Forest, which was curated by the anthropologist Bruce Albert and by Hervé Chandès, the director of the Fondation Cartier. And there was a third player who was actually in the catalog, Davi Kopenawa, who is the leader of the Brazilian branch of the Yanomami. So you had some presentations by various artists, Deliana Valéjean, Tony Osler. Also some artists had been invited in a residence to the Yanomami village to spend some time there, to get into the people, and like the photograph and filmmaker Raymond Depardon made a beautiful documentary on hunters and shaman, and also you have these images of shaman cure. What is interesting here is that there was a kind of trade-off where various participants were taking advantage of it. On the one hand, it was allowing the artist to claim the status of Western shaman. It's something which is also something which you see in lots of exhibitions. You had the exhibition Les Maîtres du Désordre at the Musée du Quai Branly 2 years ago, where basically the argument was that the art was a medium, as some religious forces, between the forces of disorder, of darkness, and our world. And finally, the message was that the Western artists were the equivalent of shaman for our work. So what is interesting is that I discussed this exhibition with friends who were from the art scene, and they loved it. What brilliant, great, very, and I hated it. Because I thought that ethnography was being, in a way, misused in the service of this message on contemporary art. So I think it's also something which makes us think. So you had this aspects in the Yanomami exhibition. It was providing also for the visitors, for the audiences, a pristine image of an Indian people living peacefully and harmoniously in the tropical rainforest. At the same time, it was a political deal, because it allowed the Yanomami, who needed some political support, to gain support within Brazil against the interests which were acting against the Yanomami reservations, by gaining this scope of I think, their voice on this contemporary art platform, they would gain the possibility to make a claim and to be heard outside of Brazil. So really he had sort of a trading pristine image, primitivist one, against some political clout. I also want to say a word about the recent exhibition on Morocco, which was at the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, curated by Jean-Hubert Martin, and also a Moroccan curator. And the idea was that actually you had to use contemporary art to show the actuality of Morocco. And here, as you see, it's to show that Morocco is claiming diversity of cultural heritages in different languages, in Arabic, in French, in Kazakh. So it was the exhibition had been organized together with the Moroccan officials, and they had lots of very interesting pieces, of very interesting articles, artists. But one thing which was conspicuous is that you had these works, and you also had some rugs here on the walls. Here you see the works on the rugs, and here you see also some, which is of course the handcraft is very important from a Moroccan point of view. It was also a way of displaying. There was some ceramics displaying the importance of that. But it was also visited by two Algerian students of mine who were very put off by this mixture of rugs and of contemporary art. As they found it orientalizing in a way, and kind of having Morocco getting stuck into this kind of vision of the past. So it's a kind of an experience which fight. Now, I want to say a few words about museums of immigration in France and in Argentina, and the place of contemporary art in it. Very briefly, so that's the outside of the Palace of the Porte de Ré, which used to house which made for the 1931 colonial exhibition to house the permanent palace of the colonies. It became, after the colonization, the Museum for African and Oceanic Arts, and when the collections went to the Quai Branly, it became the Musée of the Immigration. So of course the architecture is completely made, is a tribute to the French colonial empire and the way it brought the work. But the message is about migration. So you have some like this kind of display of luggage, you have the traditional kind of presentation, caricatures, and you also have some photographic works, which is like a chronicle by photograph of a place where immigrants live in Grenoble, and you have, which is maybe the best, which was the most interesting thing in the museum, in my view, which is the Dream Machine by Kader Attias. I was in the hall of the museum, and you see this young woman who has a veil, and who is looking at this, and actually it's the idea of consumption, but here you have halal gin, you have halal condoms, you have how to lose your suburban accent in 3 days, and all these kind of things. And what I like about this work is that it's open-ended. You don't know. First of all, you see this woman, you think that she's a visitor, and you come and you say she's not a visitor, she's part of an exhibition. And then you don't really know the meaning of it. So whereas the museum is very close in a way, it's really showing how our immigrants coming as cultural aliens into France progressively became French citizens. And it was the same thing if it was the Germans or the Belgians in the 19th century, or the Portuguese or Spanish later, or the people from Morocco, Algeria, or Black Africa today. It's the same story. Here, the work opens up something like kind of ambivalence. You don't know what the message is. And I think it's good in a way, because it opens up some space. But in a way, the problem is that the works of art, no one is addressing the discrepancy between the building, which was made for the film exhibition, as I told, and the content of the museum, which is showing the integration of immigrants into France. This kind of hiatus stays unresolved throughout the exhibition. So there is no connection between the museum and its building. Now, I want to compare this with the Museo della Inmigración in Buenos Aires, which is a very recent museum, and it's actually in the building which was an immigrant hostel, which used to receive the immigrants, and actually you still have some people, it's still in the Ministry of Interior, you still have people queuing to get visas in the first floor. So you have the museum, it's a kind of very still, and it's into the museum. So what I wanted to show here, you have the photographs of the museum's classic thing, and here look at the picture with the beds, which is how the room used to be at the time. And they had this exhibition, this installation, which is creating the atmosphere of the beds, and it's here with the mirrors, and you get an idea of how the room was with all the migrants. So it's a very very interesting way of using the space, of using the installation to create some effects. So it's both aesthetic and meaningful. I also have there's things. Some other ways of putting the records on display, which is also a very powerful effect of all this being within the museum. Oh, no. Okay. And finally, what I find interesting is how art is used to bring in history, in a way. So it's use of artistic means to bring in history. And I wanted to show, maybe one of these, which is at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., The Wall of Gold by the artist John Enrica. I think it's a very powerful installation because it brings together artifacts which usually are presented in different museums. You have the weapons, you have the gold, you have the pre-Columbian golden artifacts, and you have the money of the Spanish conquistadores. And you see the contrast between the metals, between the spades and the gold is very powerfully makes a very strong message about the meeting of different worlds. So I think it's very interesting because it brings history here through artistic means, but it's very carefully thought out. Yeah, so I won't say the rest because it's with that image, which I'm doing anyway. I'm coming to an end. So, well, what I've done in this presentation, in a way, is a kind of strolling in various museums. And you've seen that I'm more skeptical than the first speaker, in a way more cautious about this kind of the way art can and usefully and profitably be used in museums. Or rather, I think it's not only the pairing of curator and artist. Actually, what's important in a way is to understand the museum as a sensory experience, as a visual experience, and here artists can be important, can be influential, but also scenographers and curators can also play their own role. Well, I want to say a few things. One of the things is about the museum. We tend to think, when we think of contents of an exhibition, and when we show images of exhibition, we tend to think of museums as a space with rooms, and as something which is static. We imagine it as something which is trying to be consistent in the room and trying to have to imagine the visitor, which is starting from the beginning of the exhibition and then going to the end. Whereas in fact, the museum isn't as a space. It's also a space. It becomes a space when people do images of it. It becomes static in many images. but it's also a movement. It is the movement of visitors within space, which sometimes is completely different from the one which is imagined. People, when you go to the large museums, people get lost. They have the maps, and they go to they miss great parts of the museums. They enter the exhibitions by the end. They miss the second part, as was the case at the museum, because you had an exhibition in two parts. You have to cross the door, and then you just don't understand. You have to go on, so you miss the second part. So this movement, and for the visitors, the exhibition is only part of the museum as a whole, of the museum experience as a whole, which is not only exhibition and only collections, but also the cafeteria, the external spaces, the museum shop. So I think in that context, contemporary art is called upon for, I'd say, two reasons. One of them is because it's kind of a way of exit for curators and museums, because artists are irresponsible. Irresponsible in kind of legal sense. So artists, and what an artist doesn't really belong to the institution, is invited. He has a kind of more or less free hand, but it's a kind of disclaimer. So it's art. It's not us. So we're at the museum. We don't necessarily endorse the message of the artist. But it's artistic freedom. Sometimes it can create problems, of course. But there is kind of disclaimer which allows some kind of freedom for museums, but sometimes also can become a kind of dichotomous of schizophrenic discourse between this museum of the institution and the artist, which is there. So it can open up in some cases. It can also serve as an excuse for curators to remain uninvolved. And the other thing is that, of course, the artist acts as a magnet, because it's supposedly, when you ask, for instance, an artist to be curator of a special exhibition, to choose some pieces in the museum, is sort of reworking, and it turns the museum into a work of art, in the same way that the architect was also making the museum to a work of art. So you're redefining the museum itself as a work of art, and not every single one. So it can, again, be very creative and interesting, but it's also, well, it doesn't solve all the problems. So what I've been trying to do by evoking a few experiences in various contexts is to hopefully allow us to reflect on the status of aesthetics and museums, and of the aesthetics, not the artists. I think it's more important. It's more than just artists and anthropologists. I think to see the importance of architecture, the way the museum is created, the atmosphere of the museum is very important. So the creative. So finally, to come back to the provocation of Chemetov, that the concept of a scientific museum is impossible. And there are only art museums. In a way, it's a tendency for many museums to, in fact, follow this way of saying we only have art museums. So even the science museums have to become artistic in their own ways. At the same time, a museum who's aiming at enlarging understandings, as are most of the museums you work in, and possibly by drawing on scholarship and on aesthetics, maybe has to think beyond this message. So finally, what is important is to be visually engaging, to be conscious of the visual dimension and sensorial dimension of the museums, but not only by artists, but also by scenographers, by curators. I think it's very much of a joint work, and I think I've shown some experiences which I actually were working, some of them which were not working so well, and part of it in the kind of dialogue which exists between the artist and the museographic program which is right. Ok, so grazie.
Allora, grazie a Benoît per questa interessantissima comunicazione, che tra l'altro mi trova d'accordissimo su svariati punti. Mi ha fatto molto piacere che abbia mostrato l'immagine di questa installazione frutto della interazione, che è l'unica, secondo me, procedura che porta dei risultati concreti tra curatore ed artista, del National Museum of North American Indian di Washington. Io ricordo una bellissima installazione invece allo stesso museo, ma nella sede di New York, dove ci sono tutta una serie di mocassini compilati, cioè dal punto di vista espositivo, secondo una spirale. E questo è un elemento importantissimo, perché rispecchia sia la centralità della danza e della performance nelle comunità tipo native nordamericane, cioè sia il concetto, come dire, cosmogonico, cioè della spirale centrale nelle loro politiche mitologiche e della creazione. Io sono d'accordissimo su quello che ha detto, che in realtà l'artista, come dire, svincolato da ogni tipo di dialogo, di costruzione di un prodotto con il curatore, cioè è in realtà un qualche cosa di, come dire, è come se fosse una spina nel fianco, cioè nel senso che è qualche cosa che non si collega esattamente con quello che un museo dovrebbe tipo dire. Io ricordo per esempio che ho in questo caso non collaborato ma sfruttato un'opera di un artista che tutti quanti voi conoscete, il Cascionivare, che voi sapete realizza questi manichini utilizzando i wax print per discutere, per mettere in crisi il concetto di autenticità delle culture tipo africane, in una mostra che feci qui al Museo Pigorini nel lontano 2001 su il linguaggio dei tessuti dei wax print in Africa, che sono, come giustamente Sciolibari sottolinea, l'elemento massimo di contaminazione e di commistione, perché realizzati in Europa su tecnica indonesiana, commercializzati tipo in Africa, dove continuano ad avere un significato di linguaggio non verbale, cioè comunicano dei messaggi senza bisogno di esprimere concetti tramite dei disegni che tra l'altro non sono neanche realizzati da grafici africani ma da grafici occidentali, per cui c'è questa contaminazione. E in quell'occasione esposi un'opera che Sciolibari realizzò per la Biennale di Venezia, e quindi voglio dire, cioè, utilizzai, cioè non collaborai, però in altri casi abbiamo realizzato qua al Museo Pigorini delle installazioni con un artista, una fattispecie senegalese, che ha realizzato per noi un baobab stilizzato in materiali di scarto riciclati per una mostra che facemmo sui cultigeni di alcune parti del mondo, e questo qua era il baobab, era questo cultigeno scelto per rappresentare le sperimentazioni agricole del Senegal, per cui c'è fondamentale questa interazione. E, tra l'altro quando ha fatto vedere Benoît all'inizio quella mostra dove venivano mescolate vari reperti, tra cui appunto gli abiti, mi è venuto in mente l'allestimento di questa mostra, che peraltro è in corso alle Scuderie del Quirinale a Roma, su Matisse Arabesque, dove in realtà c'è la figura di questo artista che tutti noi conosciamo e ammiriamo, non è declinata soltanto attraverso le sue pitture o i suoi disegni, ma è visto come personalità tutto tondo, e tra le altre cose sono esposti in mostra anche i costumi che lui stesso ha disegnato per le Chants du Rossignol di Stravinsky, con vari filmati eccetera. Per cui e questo io noto che affascina molto il pubblico visitante la mostra, perché si trova davanti a un approccio differente dal solito, per cui appunto non ci sono soltanto appunto tele o disegni, ma anche altro tipo di materiali, tra cui appunto materiali africani, maschere, costumi, kimono cinesi, giapponesi, cioè tutti oggetti che hanno influenzato nel decoro la creatività di Matisse. Però appunto è importante affascinare, attrarre con esposizioni divertenti, in qualche modo innovative anche nell'accostamento di materiali disparati, il pubblico nostro. Grazie ancora. A questo punto io direi che possiamo dare inizio al dibattito. Se qualcuno ha da chiedere informazioni o chiarimenti o interagire con i nostri due relatori di questa mattina, è naturalmente libero di farlo. Grazie.
Michael Mohamed from Musem, France. Thank you for those two very inspiring speeches. So there are several things that I would like to share with you, just remarks through the different speeches that have been made. I actually like the comparison you made, Benoît, between mall and museums, because it's actually the case in Asia, in Maghreb, and in the whole Arabic Gulf, which somehow launches the question of modernity, and what is your relationship to modernity, which is to be part of a network. And in Europe, usually, you show your museums, when in the country that I have mentioned, you show your malls, which is actually always the case. And that's another question. Then, the question that haven't been done is, how do we finance museum, which is basically the question. And usually museums have been used in an urban renewal project. That's the case in Glasgow, Bilbao, Musem. And then the question is also, how do you do your museum, and how do you communicate with the politics that finance the museum? Then the question is, how do you measure a good museum? This is with the number of visitors you have, which we agree about that is a pity. This is the only thing we have, basically, to measure a good museum politics. This is just scale figure. Million visitors equal good museum. That's it. And then we lose, of course, the question of quality of content, which actually it is sad, but this is the whole logic of blockbuster exhibitions and etc. So this is just a remark. Then the other thing is also somehow how museums have changed their policy, and today how they are in competition between entertainment and culture. So within the European Union, it's rather clear that the European Union have made a community of consumers consuming products. Cultural products is part of it. But it's very also interesting that the European Union financed the program which are which we are meeting today, because the question is how the museum can influence the definition of European citizenship. So I'm not sure that the focus is in between entertainment, culture, consumer, citizens. Nevertheless, there is somehow a balance to find in between. I think it is a good thing to have a new way to produce knowledge, and it is important to see how museums can integrate the way to produce knowledge, to consider visitors, and also how we work in a vertical way to communicate to our audiences, and how today, in a competitive audience, offer, and etc., how the museum can still find a balance. So I would situate it myself as in between. It's important to have fun, to offer fun. Nevertheless, it's important to have content and a proper content. There is, just to conclude, there is a very interesting report which will be given by the European Commission at the end of this year about the threat of Disneylandization of culture within the European Union. This is it.
Do we respond or do we take more questions? Okay. è meglio rispondere.
Sì, forse.
Grazie. No, sorry, thank you. Je peux répondre en français? No. Okay. Well, yes. That's exactly. Well, the idea of funding is exactly what I began by saying that museums are run by numbers, because that's exactly the idea of the success is the public. And I remember when I sent my book to Stéphane Martin, who is the director of the Musée du Quai Branly, and it was my book on the shift from the Musée de l'Homme and to the Museum. Well, the book is very interesting, but there is it's very much the anthropologist's point of view, because what is absent is the public. And what he meant is that, well, you can make whatever criticism you want. I mean, with the numbers I have, it's all right. I mean, and any kind of intellectual critique is in a way devaluated by success, and it's a kind of a response, because that's exactly what the Ministry of Culture wants to hear. That's what the authorities want to hear. That's really, as I said, it's really the measure of success for good and worse. Another measure can be, in some cases, that museums are being talked about, exhibitions are being talked. But so it is always something which you can put all the articles where the exhibition was mentioned, but still, if at the end you fail to bring in the audience, it's not so much a success. So I personally enjoy going to museums. What I like was just trying to show some different aspects of this, and I think. It's actually, that's really the challenge for the museums, is how to be at the same time to keep to keep the need to be to follow scholarship, to try to take the public seriously, and at the same time, since you have to compete with all these other sources of entertainment and consumption, you also have to find some ways to, in a way, try to find some terms, some mediating terms, some ways of that. So that's why I think really the kind of thinking in terms of what is the museum experience of the public is very important. We're trying to and thinking of what is the museum experience as a whole. With all these things, which is because that's basically what people want to see. So in a way, as you said, if people they go to malls, but it seems to me that in Marseille, many people they will go, if it's a sunny day, they will go to the museum, and when they have visitors from other parts of France, they will take them to the museum to show them the place and things, instead of going to the mall, which is a very good success. For the museum, but it's part of the museum experience, and it's different maybe from the way curators and scholars may experience it.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. Ines de Castro, Stuttgart. I would like to make perhaps a little difficult question. We have been talking about the artist interventions in museums, and I'm just wondering, what are the advantages of working with artists and or perhaps indigenous scholars? Is that something different, or what do you see? I don't know if working with artists is really an advantage for the public. If I see, for example, the examples of Berlin, the Berlin Lab that were made in a couple of last years, perhaps you could specify for me what is there a different view, or is it the freedom that Benoît said that they are not they are not bound into this museum, or I think sometimes we are seeking to be seen as museums of art because there have more public and perhaps more finance possibilities, and so is this only on Vogue or on mode a la moda, I don't know what you say in English, to invite, to invite an artist just to be seen as we do also art, or we are as important as the art museums, or is there anything you could specify more precisely that would say, okay, I would prefer to take an artist than an indigenous scholar, for example, or somebody from the countries?
Yes, I cannot, I mean, this falls as much into Benoît's field as mine, but I cannot really speak for the museums, but what I can speak for is perhaps to see this rather as a third subject, as a common field of inquiry, because what I've been advocating is really to engage also conceptually and intellectually, theoretically, if you wish, with the contemporary arts of the last, at least the last 30 years. And then I think a number of benefits can be drawn in this conclusion, which I've pointed out in terms of the discussion in anthropology on the senses, in terms of discussion on materiality, in terms which I haven't fully developed now in the presentation, in terms of, we can maybe talk about this, in terms of ethics, in fact. And these have important reverberations, I think, in museums too. So it's not, I appreciate that now from the institutional side there is a discussion on the public, but these have important implications actually for the way we theorize about the objects, which are in the museums and of which the museums are in a way the holders and custodians. And of course that includes also, this has been going on for some time, the relation to the source communities and to indigenous scholars, of course, including scholars of the visual and with the visual, if you like. That also goes hand in hand. So I think there are very good reasons not to separate it and just to leave it in the domain of museum anthropologists, and I include myself of academic, university-based anthropologists. So it's a broader argument, but I don't want to fill it normatively. That's why I've been speaking about taking from Clifford, I acknowledge the genealogy here, about the speaking terms. I think each project will have to establish this in pragmatic terms, but also in theoretical terms.
Yes, well, I think it's a very good question. Actually, it seems to me that the tendency is more to call indigenous artists, which is in a way rather than indigenous scholars or people or scholars, because I think actually we should have more experiments. I remember when Clémentine Delis presented a project of having artists in residence at the Ethnography Museum. Someone said that when we will have anthropologists in residence in art museums, also being able to go and touch them and so there is a kind of also of asymmetry in this kind of thing. And I think one of the things is asking scholars. Maybe because it's something which was okay. Well, scholars, we already know what they do. So it's something that you do. If you go to the artists, you're more innovative, you're more radical, you're more. Whereas, but certainly, I think it's a very interesting point.
Yes, I have a comment, which maybe also is a question. I think one thing is not, maybe Arndt has mentioned it somehow, we sometimes involve artists not to draw a larger public, but maybe to visualize a concept that we can't visualize with our collections or, ideas. We need sometimes contemporary artists to convey certain concepts or critiques or ideas that we are not able to convey with objects. And also that, as you said, anthropologists would express with words. So, and you said the importance is the visual engaging that we need to attract the public and to make the public understand what we want to say. So sometimes, you know, if you think of these boring and exhibitions of anthropologists in the past, and if you look at some museums that still have the displays of the 70s, you have these objects lined up, and then you have all these texts and very bad images and maps, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't say anything to the public any longer, and it's part of the crisis of the ethnographic museums, because they were not able to convey visually what they wanted to say, and that's always my critique to ethnographic museums, it's the aesthetics of their display. And this has to do something, I think, as well with anthropologists losing, you know, not getting involved or missing this high time of curatorship. You know, if I think of Harald Seemann, you know, and people, or Rudowski, people who kind of were able to convey with objects their ideas, and the curator is a creative individual that creates, you know, an own world with objects, and with this he's able to convey an idea. And I think anthropologists and anthropology museum missed that moment, and now it's not possible any longer because of the departmentalization in the museums. You know, now education is very important and things like that, and all kinds of other frameworks in which we have to work, where we don't have this liberty any longer, but the artist still has that liberty. And so we can use contemporary art interventions to convey things that we could not convey as curators any longer. But on the other hand, a comment what happens very often, and which we mention in our concept for SWICH, is this quick fix, you know, invite an artist for 2 months and then just do something, and it doesn't relate, it's not a dialogue with the museum, the history, and what it wants. I think that is a very a development I dislike. And another comment which I wanted to make about what Mikael said, the Disneyification. I think that the contemporary art world experiences a Disneyification. Yeah, if you think of the Biennales or the Documenta, I mean, they draw a public which is immense. You know, it's like Disney World, and people go there to have the same experience or a comparative experience than when they go to theme parks. Because the contemporary art biennales, they sort of create a sort of theme park where you can go with your family, that you can play. It's a participative art, it's interaction, it's a visual experience, and it gives you this experience. It's a comparative experience, yeah. And also we don't have that, and I think that's also part of the success of contemporary art exhibitions.
Yeah, well, thank you, Barbara. You know, I'm a fan of your curating, so which is, I think, very creative. I think I fully agree with what you say. I think it's the first beginning by the end. I think what is important, what you mentioned, is that it changes the experience of going to the museum. So people come with expectations which are in a way framed by other experiences of going. So they want to find this maybe some in the ethnographic museum, and in a way it can be a response, but in a way it's the best response to do this. The other point is that about the institutional freedom, which I said the artist can do things that the curator cannot make anymore because it's tied in by all the institutional constraints. Yes, so calling an artist, and here it can be in a way creative if people manage to make some kind of an alliance with artists and to have kind of productive dialogue, which they can use it. And that occurred. I had a very small and very minor experience when producing an exhibition of photographs in Paris, where people who had done the research in the field were collaborating with students from the École des Arts Décoratifs, les Arts Déco, and they had all this visual culture, and they would transform our photographs, which are like basic, into something completely different, and really because they had this visualizing capacity of seeing the potential of a picture to turn it into something else than just a documentary exhibition. So the other thing is that, which I think is important, is that there is a change in the way people see the ethnographic museum, because in the way of experiences, if you look at it, when the Museum was created in the 1930s, having a photograph in the exhibition was very modern, and actually was the equivalent of having a multimedia device now. It was meant to sort of, you had the object which was seen as dead if it wasn't there, but if you had the image showing the object in use, the visitor was supposed to make mentally a kind of an operation of looking at the map, at the photograph, at the object, the thing, and the showcase was meant as a kind of a whole, which was creating this effect. So at the time, this was understood as being modern, as being dynamic, as being lively, and of course it lost this because we got so used to it. Now it seems dull and boring and déjà vu. So it's quite very difficult to understand from our point of view how modern it was. Wow, it's great! They have photographs in the showcases. Wow! So it's really, I think this change of perspective is also important. So of course the expectations are changing.
Yes, I would like to come back to one point which was just mentioned now, and that is the supposed quick fix of the contemporary, of the artist coming in with an intervention in the exhibition. It's perhaps quite good to look again at that kind of art, or go back to the art I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, which recently has been coined under the term relational art, or under various forms. You can think of community art, of socially engaged art, of art which in our case would work with source communities, but also which would work with the public in the geographic location where the museum is located. A public of very different kinds, depending on how this museum is located, of communities of different social and other identity extraction, if you like. I leave it at that. But then we have to distinguish, in order not to be essentialized. Then we have to distinguish, of course, and this parallels much of the discussion of fieldwork by artists and by anthropologists, if you look at those, of how profound or how deep such relations are. And there's some very interesting, and again, I'm not saying this, if you listen carefully, I'm not saying this from the high vantage point of anthropology, which supposedly has the better fieldwork method, and has, as it were, a priority on fieldwork. But I'm saying this because in modern theorizing about curatorship, for example by Paul O'Neill, who is now at Bard College, there are also approaches which have been speaking about the durational approaches in curating. So we have, in fact, and he has written another book published by MIT Press called Cultures of Curating. There are, in fact, approaches with very long-term communities. He takes some examples, in this case in Denmark and the Netherlands and so forth, where certain cities or neighborhoods have commissioned artists to stay really with the project for a very, very long time, over years, that is. And this parallels, in some ways, anthropology's engagement with communities, you see. So there are, of course, not formula, but precedents also in the contemporary art, which work differently, which do not work on the one ad hoc intervention going in and coming out. Grant Kester has also written at length about this, criticizing, in fact, such projects which are very impressive, like by the He's interesting, of course, the Belgian artist resident in Mexico City, Francis Alice, of just going in for a spectacular project, but not really engaging the particular community, in this case, of a shanty town near Lima. So we have to then rethink perhaps this, and not take contemporary art just as the visual fix, but also as a facilitator or collaborator in longer-term social relations, which can benefit then the museum too.
Thank you both for your presentation. I will try to be brief. I would like to pick an element from Arnaldo's presentation in relation to ethics. I think in museums we have a problem with regard to ethics, because we speak about ethics code of ethics, ethics issues, but I think that we have a big difference to do between ethics and deontology. And in museum, deontology is ethics, and it's not the same thing. A code of ethics, it's a code of norms. Ethics underlies an individual choice. And I think about my own work on traffic, African art traffic. I've been working for 15 years in this domain, and I followed the debate on displaying of provenance and object in museums since 90, so 25 years. And I saw a lot of evolutions in displaying plundered object in museum. And this is a question for me on the relationship between anthropology and museums. I think that ethics, the norm is the deontology. In ethics, you have not a norm. It's an homogenization of individual choice. This is the norm, the normatization made by deontological codes. But this is not ethics. And the problem in concrete is that when you display unprovenanced objects, museums, in my opinion, are not ethical, in spite of official discourses, because they don't present to the public the making of or their own decision of why, what you have to hide, what you have to show. And I think this is a problem of it. It creates a sort of inequality between the knowledge offered to the public and the information, detailed information on the reason of why these objects are in this museum. And I want to be brief, but I think about the exhibit, the displaying of the Throne of Weapons by British Museum, and the book of James Kuno on authenticity and universal aesthetics and so on. And I think that this is not an ethical way of presenting plundered object, for instance, because museum doesn't inform the public about detailed information of the making of on how objects arrive in museums. And in my opinion, with relation to the new museum theory and the manifesto, and I think about Silverman works and so on, I think we speak a lot about transparency in museum, but in this case, museums are not transparent, I think. So it's an for me, this is an ethical question, not a deontological one.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment. When I mentioned And again, I cannot speak so much for the museum. It was interesting for me to listen to you and about what kind of changes or what kind of application, if any, notion of ethics has in museums. When I spoke about ontology, I was rather referring to, although there are very interesting connections, I can see this now, I was rather referring to a recent turn in theorizing in some quarters of anthropology, which comes from phenomenology broadly and which has been taken up by a number of Brazilian scholars, Viveiros de Castro, others in France and so forth, but also in Britain. And this has more to do with the way of how we do anthropological theory and how much the theory, if you like, the theorizing of the people we work with, the research subjects, will form part of this. So this is a broader subject or a broader project rather, and it has also implications perhaps for the museum and also for ethics, because then the next question could be in parallel to declarations of intangible and tangible heritage, how far but that's a broader discussion. How far these notions are particularistic and how far are they universal and so forth. You have this parallel where anthropologists intervene in discussions of, in quotation marks, universal human rights. Yeah. This is that. Perhaps what the museum needs sometimes, and now I'm a little bit devil's advocate in being normative, it needs a kind of Hans Hake doing an institutional critique of the of the anthropology museums as well. I mean, this is perhaps some in short-term interventions. This is perhaps where some contemporary artists have been at their best. Working on the notion of the museum. Here I can only refer to the contemporary art museums and the so-called institutional critique, of which Hans Hake is one of the exponents, and also other artists. So, anyway.
Perhaps add something in the idea of the origin of the objects.
Sorry.
The not showing the origin of the object. Actually, some museums do it. It was, I mean, Boris Westhill had done it at Tervuren, the Exit Congo exhibition. Now, in the new Museo Ethnography de Genève, is you have the origin of every object which is traceable, and especially you have the showcase on Gabon is not on Gabonese culture, but it's Le Gabon de Fernand Reber, or by the name of the missionary who brought so many artifacts to the museum. And you actually have the drawings of the missionary. So what is the showcase is not about Gabonese culture, it's about the relationship between Europe and other parts of the world. And then the presence of Europe in the exhibition in the 5 continents is also something which is conspicuous. So the whole thing, and here we come back to the idea of colonial legacies, is showing the museum as colonial legacy, both the artifacts and the museum itself, which I think is one of the challenges, especially for ethnographic museums, is to deal with this the way the colonial legacies, and I take it in an open-ended meaning of colonial legacies being not something which is given, but something which is contested, which is shared and divided, in the sense of both sharing and opposition and conflictual, is something which is very important.
Yeah, perhaps my question emerges from the last two comments, and I think it's good. Schneider, you said earlier that art, so to think about art and anthropology as a common space of inquiry. And in a way, I find that liberating. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. But what has happened, I think, there are several issues that I have with, I think that working with artists is important, but the first issue that I have is an issue of contemporaneity. It's a temporal issue. We always look to the artist to get us into time, to get us into the present, because it seems that there is no anthropology of the present. And therefore, what we do is that the artist is the person who moves us out of the past into the present. I'm talking about what the museums do, isn't it? So my question would be, what then would be an anthropology of the present that the museum can do, that can show that present that is also urgent, rather than requiring an artist? So how do we deal with that question of contemporaneity? That's my first question. And the second thing is that the contemporary artist, if we were to look at it as a common field of inquiry, then we can think of the contemporary artist as coming into the museum to be a part of imagining the present and futures, of thinking about some of the things that are happening, but we remain in the moment of institutional critique. That we have been involved in an institutional critique as ethnographic museums, artists come in to critique. And while that is productive, and I think anybody who knows me knows that my colonialism is my, I talk about it a lot, so I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of that. But the question therefore is, how do we reach that common moment of inquiry where we're talking about the present and tracking moments to the future? That is my second challenge that I'd like to put to you. And my last challenge is this thing of, I find, and I might be incautious, I find that, for example, the triennale, intense proximity, that there is a possibility that art becomes a fetishization of anthropology, rather than that art and anthropology is overlapping to try and think about these common nodes of inquiry. And what I find that is lacking is that, and forgive me if I sound incautious again, that art museums are not necessarily whipping themselves over the back as much, beating themselves as much about how they engage with ethnography, as anthropology museums whip themselves over the back about how they engage with art. Art is always a solution, in my opinion, in our museum. And I think we need to move to where you suggested, which is this common area of critique. Because if we don't, at the last point, sorry, is that even you suggested that working with artists is a way of understanding, as a way of critiquing whatever, continues a privileging of one sense. You speak about anthropology of the senses, but it continues the privileging of the eyes. But what I'm saying is that if we were to think of others who could help us to understand the present, there are poets and writers, but we don't necessarily engage with them as much. And my question is, would that also be a moment of engaging with the present or the future?
Thank you very much, Wayne, and I cannot concur more with you, what you've said. Let me come to the first part about the contemporaneity or the coevalness, as Johannes Fabian has mentioned it in his work, which I think is key here for this point of the debate, time and the other. So I think that of course we have to be in the contemporary, and there are a number of very interesting artists as well as anthropologists who work really on key moments of the global condition we are in, and conditions probably in the plural, but I can think of the work of Ursula Biemann, for example, the Swiss artist who has done many large-scale projects, for example, on issues of migrations, displacement, and so forth in the global arena. And there are many other artists also from different parts of the world. And so too have anthropologists. So too have anthropologists in the recent present worked on the global condition, not of the immediately visible, of perhaps migration pressing issues, of war and conflict and so forth, of headline issues, but they have also worked, for example, very interesting ethnographic work on, in some sense, what governs and moves us, for example, the financial crisis. We have now very good ethnographies by anthropologists working on the European Central Bank, on Wall Street, on London bankers, and so forth. And it was, in fact, and we have artists working on these issues. You see, we have, for example, George Marcus has done a work with artists together at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, together with a French anthropologist, quite noted French anthropologist, Marc Abeles. And so we have anthropologists and artists, sometimes they're working together. We have Neil Cummings and Marisa Lewandowska working. We presented them at Fieldworks in 2003, working on the notion of the gift as a term much in the discussion since Marcel Mauss, and later in the more recent past or present still very active by an eminent British anthropologist, Marilyn Strathern. So we have, and these are key notions, because the gift is theorized now. It's theorized by groups who want to get out of a kind of capitalist economy, or at least want to try other things, where with reactions to financial crises in Argentina, in the south of Europe, and so forth, some people, some social movements try, at least for parts of the economy, they can organize themselves to take them out, organize them in a way of communitarian or more egalitarian barter, and so forth. All issues on which anthropology in the present has much to say. Yeah? So these are eminently political issues, and I think there it's very interesting to have an encounter and hear the museum, if and when it starts to engage with such theoretical debates, and other anthropologists much in the media is, and I'm not professing here any judgment on the quality of these works, it's not my field, but David Graeber, who's based at Goldsmiths, has written about the debt crisis as well, and so forth. So there are many points of contacts possible, in fact. Yes, I think that's what I would have to say on this. So it's perhaps not, it's partly happening and should happen more.
Thank you, Wayne, for your provocations. I think it's a program actually for a full day of discussion. But briefly, I think it's an interesting work which is being done by the Museo Ethnography in Neuchâtel. In that respect, where they really, it's interesting because it's contemporary art by anthropologists in a way. So they really are making installations, but which are based in a kind of a quick field work and kind of really trying to engage the contemporary, the hybridity and such things. I think it's a very interesting, something which is in this direction you're mentioning. The other point I wanted to say, but I fully agree with you on the triennial intense proximity, and actually what is interesting in that in some ways, some things which have been rejected by anthropological museums as primitivism, as completely, I mean, will come back through contemporary art, which will completely embrace some visions. I was mentioning this axe fight of the Yanomami, where you had these naked Indians fighting completely as warriors, which was printed to the public without any comment. It was really, that is really what the Indians are. So, which is something which, of course, in the ethnography museum, you would difficultly find this kind of things. So it is interesting because, in a way, by being contemporary art, can be older than all ethnography in some ways, in some time.
I'm Ben from the Museum Intervento. I have a question for both speakers. The first question is very short. Perhaps the answer is very complex and complicated, and perhaps you can answer it as well. But I was rather intrigued. What is the difference between displaying in an ethnographic museum objects where one erases all the traces of the original owner, and displaying in a contemporary art gallery the smells of anonymous people? So I was intrigued by that, because he brought both up, and I wonder what is the difference, or what are the connections between these two kind of display practices. But another point, and this is perhaps more interesting for the general discussion, is that I had the impression that you were mostly speaking about museums where artists were working with so-called indigenous communities, whereas obviously I think for most of us here, we tend to work primarily with immigrant communities, i.e. People who come to Europe or have been based in Europe for a number of generations, and I think this can pose different kind of problems, because when I was listening to you, I was immediately thinking about a controversy that I'm not sure that everyone is aware of the Exhibit B performance by the South African artist Brad Bailey, where he basically reproduced the so-called human zoos, which provoked quite a number of heated reactions, notably by people in Europe from African descent, who said that it was obscene to actually reproduce these kind of practices and call it art. And I was reminded of that also because I've come across a rather similar situation. That is a white Flemish photographer who contacted me because she wants to create a work of art which is based on 19th century colonial anthropometric photographs. And she says when she shows these to white professional photographers, most of them, their first reaction is how beautiful these photographs are. Whereas if she shows them to her Moroccan and African friends, they see immediately that these are racist images, and then their reaction is, we do not need you to transform them into works of art or make them part of an artistic creation in order to show us that these are basically racist images. And then she asked me, well, I still want to do something with these images, but how do I do that? And obviously she realizes that as an artist, she supposedly has the freedom to do whatever she wants. But it rather defeats the purpose, like if you want to do this in order to espouse the case of a discriminated minority, if they then in turn turn against you and say that what you are doing is actually racist in itself, i.e. Transforming a racist activity into an artistic one, which allows you to make a living. And then for the second speaker, my question was about the idea that all museums, I know that you quoted an architect, so I'm not sure that you agree with this whole idea that all museums now become art museums. And then obviously you talked about the Museo de la in France, in Paris, and you actually only showed the contemporary art work, whereas obviously they also have, like most migration museums and like a lot of city museums, ordinary objects, i.e. the objects that migrants brought with them. And this is obviously something that an old colonial museum like the Buren Museum or other ethnographic museums have to struggle with if we wanted to transform ourselves into actual or contemporary museums. We have two options. Either we can indeed show the works of contemporary artists, be they from the source communities or from or diasporic artists, or otherwise we can show their actual contemporary material culture, which certainly for migrant communities in Europe is practically indistinguishable. We're talking about IKEA, H&M, and that kind of stuff. Whereas I do my research in the Congo, when we talk about material culture in the Congo, we talk about objects made in China of very inferior quality, as the Congolese never stop to complain about. So it begs the question, obviously every object that comes into your museum becomes museum-ified, as it were, and I would argue that it certainly becomes an historic artifact, but does it really inevitably becomes a work of art, or is it just that we have chosen indeed to privilege artistic works rather than material culture of everyday life, the way that ethnographic museums used to be?
Thank you very much for your questions and observations. I will answer the two you which refer to my presentation. The first one, what is the difference between anonymous or anonymously displayed objects in an ethnographic museum and the project by Cecil Tollers? one would have to look, since we put it in the abstract, the one part of this equation of the ethnographic collection, if we really don't have any longer the information, and it's because of the politics of display that they have been displayed as such, or if in fact through careful research, what has been happening in the rethinking over the last decades in ethnographic collections, we can in fact find out something about individual owners or owners of communities, however they are defined in their cultural context. So that's for the one side of the equation. What is with Tolas, as far as I know, this is a deliberate choice by the artist. She might not have had otherwise had the consent of the male participants to be shown olfactorily, if you like, in this exhibition to participate. I think that's a deliberate choice, as far as I can imagine, or as far as I know. But one would have to see. So that's a deliberate choice. It might also be, but you put that in the abstract without a specific reference, but we know all about these kinds of collections, or this phase of display in ethnographic collections. It might also have been deliberate that in fact people very well knew whom this was from, but decided just to display it as of being that, or that community or tribe in quotation marks. So that depends on the context. But I think for Tolas, it was a choice. It was a deliberate agreement, I would imagine, as far as I know. But yeah, the second one about anthropometric images and to use them in contemporary art, I agree, not knowing the project, that this would need very careful contextualization, I would assume. And of course, an artist intervening with and into such material in collections of an ethnographic museums where such photographic archives are held. And I've been working myself once as a film officer of the Royal Anthropological Institute. That's my colleague Chris Wright, with whom I did a number of books, was looking at the same time after the photographic collections, and there are other such collections. It would need very careful contextualization and collaboration with the specialists of photographic historians of such collections, and of course source communities and so forth. There's a number now, at least for almost 3 decades, the work by Elizabeth Edwards and others who've really established photography and anthropology is one of them. Then there are many other books and many other scholars now who've worked on this. So we have, if we wanted to launch such a project, for example, invite an artist to a museum to work on photographic collections of that period, and with these particular issues of then valid notions of racism and of anthropometric practices in physical anthropology. If we wanted to do a project, I think it is possible, but it would need a very careful research and contextualization and collaborations perhaps with the communities where these images were taken in past generations. But I can only say that not normatively, but in the open.
So very briefly, because everybody is hungry, I think you were a very interesting point, the one about how we deal with colonial legacies, and especially both in their materiality as images and the way we see them, and various people can see or not see these images. Actually, I have some problems with the human zoo notion, but let's not get into it. When they had this exhibition at the Quai on exhibiting the savage, one of the problems is that they didn't think about what it meant to reproduce. Like they had some films from freak shows which were projected on human size. So actually it put the spectator in being into the position of going to a freak show, which I've never done in my life. But then I saw these people who were dwarfs, and it felt very badly at it, because they hadn't thought about what it meant to reproduce images in an exhibition. So they wanted to be critical, but actually they ended up doing the same as what they wanted to criticize. As for what you mentioned about the ordinary object, of course I wasn't endorsing Shemetov's statement. I was taking it as a provocation for us to respond. But I think the point, the problem specifically at the Porte Dorée, and the reason why they went, I've shown some ordinary objects, but that we have a poor collection, because it's a collection of poor. So the objects are poor because the people were poor. So it doesn't make visually something impressive. If you want to show some luggage, some few things, some few, and actually it's so they went to the way we're going to bring in some contemporary art because this will be visually impressive. This will make a collection. It's not a real collection to have some ordinary artifacts. And what I think for ethnographic museums, they had some ordinary daily life artifacts, but since they were the daily life from people who were different, that's why they were interesting, because by showing the daily life artifacts, I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not saying I'm saying in the mind of the people who created this, if you showed some daily life of others, then it was interesting, of peasants or of people in Congo, it was interesting. But if you want to show IKEA or H&M furniture, then it's not interesting because it doesn't show difference. So this is a problem for the museum. If you want to show contemporary culture, it's because it's actually something which has been thought about in Britain when people were saying, how do we, when Malinowski was working on cultural contact, how do we show cultural contact in museums? How do we show Japanese bicycles in East Africa in a showcase? I mean, we should be able to do that. And something which the museums, the Tropen Museum for a time did this kind of thing, and then so this kind of mimicking of reality, and then well, it also became outmoded and outworn. I think it's a real issue, and part of the reason why people will go to art, be it classical art, as in Kebroli, or contemporary art, is because they have a feeling that ordinary objects are too poor to be shown. I know that some people, I mean, some exhibitions which had been proposed to the Kebroli, they said, well, no, it's too poor. It's not interesting because the objects are too poor. They're not visually impressive enough. So it's something that won't attract the public. So it's something which is very, it's a crucial issue for museums to deal with that.